First of all, I want to say thank you for coming out. It's great to see such a packed room. And it's also great, I want to say hello to those of you who are listening or seeing this on the live stream. This is the first time I am live streaming one of my lectures, so that's pretty exciting. We're going to try to see if we can, no-go? Okay, we can't take any comments or questions on the stream. With all this technology, something was bound to hiccup, right? So I want a show of hands. How many of you have attempted to take photos of the night sky, the stars, and the Milky Way? Okay, quite a few of you. The key word there was attempted. How many of you were happy with the photos that you attempted to take? So, okay, about half of those who raised their hands. Nighttime photography is a lot of fun. As you'll see tonight, we're going to talk about a lot of different aspects of it. It also takes some practice, and it's a little bit more of a challenge because you're working in the dark, so that makes things a little bit more difficult for you. One of the things that Don and I recommend to the people who join us for our workshops is to spend some time practicing with your camera in the dark. Try to find all of your buttons and dials and things and get familiar with your camera in the dark so that you don't have to keep turning on a light. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, turning on a light can be something that isn't always very good when you're photographing around a bunch of other people. So we encourage everyone to become familiar with their equipment so they can manipulate it without the use of any extra lights. So the picture that's on the screen right now, we're going to talk about it more in detail later, but it is from one of the locations that we use on my workshops in Westcliff. And I want to start out with this quote from a friend of mine, my friend Andrew. Actually, we're giving away Andrew's book today. He came out in August and visited Breckenridge, and we went out to get some night sky photography, and he came up with this quote. And I said, "Can I use this?" He said, "Sure." Who needs sleep when you have photo opportunities like this? When we go out on our workshops, I actually was concerned, and I have other people share this concern, that they're not going to be able to stay up all night. Well, I didn't think I could, but Don and I have been doing this for 2 years now, and I'm already kind of tired thinking about it, but we have a busy schedule for this year. When you're out under the stars, it's so amazing, especially when you're in a dark place like Westcliff. And the time just goes by so fast. When you see the stars come out and the Milky Way moving across the sky, and then pretty soon the sky gets lighter in the morning, and it's time to switch to photographing the sunrise. So that's my quote from Andrew. Okay, a little bit about me. I'm the owner of Three Peaks Photography. I also am the founder of the Colorado Photography Learning Groups. I see some members here in the audience. I also have a radio show called The Photo Show, and you can find episodes at studio809radio.com. Next week, I'm very excited to say that on Monday of next week, I'm going to be recording my next episode, and my guest is going to be Royce Bear. If you're not sure who Royce is, as I call him, the godfather of night sky photography. He's a super nice guy. He's an amazing photographer, so I'm very excited to have him on the show. A little bit about our workshops. We do 6 workshops a year in Westcliff. If you've never been to Westcliff, it's an amazing place. It is the first dark sky community first dark sky community in Colorado as designated by the International Dark Sky Association. It is also the world's highest. And we have dates, one a month from May until the end of September. You can go to my website to find out more information. You have brochures and business cards on your chairs. And then we have an arrangement with the county to do workshops at the paint mines. I also have to include a PSA here that The paint mines are closed after dark, so in order to photograph the night sky out there after hours, you have to have a permit, and you can call the county parks office to arrange for one. But we have 8 dates scheduled, and we only take 6 students on each of those workshops. So if you've ever been out to the paint mines, the section where the biggest hoodoos are is very narrow, so we like to limit the amount of people we take there, just because we don't want people tripping over each other and getting in the way of each other's pictures. Plus, that allows you to get more one-on-one instruction from both Don and myself. All right, so some of you may have wondered, or may wonder, when the best times and dates are for viewing the Milky Way. The core of the Milky Way, which is where we see the concentration of gases in the Milky Way, is visible to us in the northern hemisphere basically around the end of February or early March into the beginning of October. And I compiled this chart, the information in this chart, based on information that I got from the app PhotoPills. If you don't have PhotoPills, it's a great app to help you plan your trips, especially if you're looking at doing night sky stuff. So these are all the dates of the new moon for this year for the what we call the Milky Way season, times when you can actually see the galactic core.
It says 2018.
Oh, sorry. It should be 2019, so I need to correct that. Thank you. So you can see that in the early months, March and April, the galactic core is not visible until 2:30 or 1:30 in the morning. You can still see the rest of the Milky Way all year round. However, the galactic core is only visible during those months. And those are the months where we schedule our workshops. All right, so I'm going to point out some things to look for in the night sky. By the way, I did this presentation last week in Pueblo, and I realized that lightsabers make good pointers. So I'm going to use my lightsaber. I'm not going to turn it on because it makes noise, but we're going to talk about lightsabers in a little bit. So a couple things for you to look for to spot the Milky Way in the sky. If you're in a dark place, it's obvious where the Milky Way is. Sometimes if you're just getting out to a dark place and your eyes haven't adjusted yet, it'll take a little bit for you to be able to see it. And one of the things that you look for is the constellation Cassiopeia, which looks like a giant W in the sky. And the northern end of the Milky Way runs directly through Cassiopeia. So if you can spot Cassiopeia, then keep looking and you'll see the Milky Way. This is a shot of the other end of the Milky Way that includes the galactic core. So that's also pretty obvious. One of the things that we look for, especially earlier in the season, is the constellation Scorpio. And the galactic core runs fairly close to Scorpio in the sky, usually in the southern or southeast to southwestern sky. Can anybody see the Big Dipper in this picture? Okay, I'm going to help you out a little bit. Okay. Another thing to look for is the Big Dipper. If you follow the last 2 stars that make up the end of the cup to the next brightest star in the sky, that is the North Star or Polaris. And then you can take images of the stars rotating around like this. This is what we call a circumpolar rotation. And you can see the North Star is in the middle of this. This is a 20-minute exposure, and you can see the amount of movement in the stars that you get in that type of exposure. So it's always fun to find the North Star and create images like this. All right, what are you going to do to prepare for your trip or your night sky shoot? Looks like a couple people there are excited about planning. I saw some heads nodding, so okay. First of all, it's important to scout out the area. We highly recommend that you scout out the area in the daytime. It is very difficult to find things at night unless you're already familiar with an area. So you can use the GPS to mark spots wherever you are trying to shoot from that you can get back to at night. Don and I can tell you how difficult it is or how easy it is to get lost when you're in the dark and lose your sense of direction. You can use a planning app such as PhotoPills. I think PhotoPills is $10, and it's well worth it because you can look up information like I showed you in that chart that I had. Make sure your batteries are charged, especially if you're going out at night in the cold, because batteries can drain very quickly. It's recommended that you keep your spare batteries in an inside pocket that's close to your body so they stay warm. There's also a company that makes the hand warmers that they make a product called a multi-muff. So it's a muff that you attach to your waist, and it has the hand warmer stuff in it, and you can keep batteries and stuff in there and keep them warm. I have yet to pick one of those up, but that might be on my list for this season. So make sure your lenses are clean, free of dust and other things. Sometimes if you have a bright light source that's off in the distance or even close by, it can create some flares in your images, so you want to make sure that your lenses are free of any debris. Get some rest. We always try to get in a nap or sleep late on a day that we have a workshop so that we can stay up later or have an easier time of staying up. Prepare for the weather. Make sure that you have rain gear with you and what have you. Make sure you dress appropriately. Make sure that you also dress in layers. I'm going to make a video to show people how to dress in layers because we've had some issues with people coming out of workshops that are basically dressed like this and they think they're going to stay warm overnight in the mountains. So it just doesn't happen. If you've lived here long enough, you know that you need to have layers and layers of warm clothes. It's a lot better to have to take off a layer because you're too warm than not having enough to keep you warm. If you're going out by yourself or with somebody else, make sure that you tell someone where you're going and when you expect to return. Another point to this is to make sure that you stick to your plan. So if you get halfway to your destination and decide that you're not going to go there and you're going to go somewhere else, if you end up having a problem and you get lost or you get hurt and you're trying to get someone to come and find you, it'll be that much more difficult if those people you told are looking in a different place. What kind of camera gear are you going to have? So you're going to obviously need a camera. You can shoot stars as star trails with a film camera, but you cannot photograph the stars as points of light with a film camera. You need a DSLR with an ISO range that goes up to at least 6400. Many of my shots are at 32, 64, or above. You'll want a wide-angle lens with an aperture of at least f4. If you have one or can spend the money on one that opens all the way up to 1.2, then that's good as well. Make sure that you have a sturdy tripod. This is another issue that we've seen on our workshops. We've had people come out with the $20 Walmart specials that you can't get the things tightened enough, and they're wobbly, and they're practically useless. So make sure that you, oops, sorry, turned down my lightsaber. Make sure that you get yourself a nice, good tripod. Another thing that has been helpful for me is to have a panoramic ball head, especially if you're going to shoot panoramic images like the one that was on the first slide. Another thing that I really recommend is an L bracket, and I have one in my bag. I forgot to bring it out, but I can bring it out later. It's a L-shaped metal piece that acts as your tripod plate. So it allows you to take your camera from a horizontal position, to a vertical position without having to change the position of the tripod head. And it's also very helpful for shooting panoramics with vertical images. So instead of having to turn your tripod head over and you swing around an arm, you are positioning the camera so it's right above the middle of the body, and you're swinging your camera along the center of the body, and that makes your panoramic stitching much easier. Bring some lights for light painting. We have some up here that I'll show you, some of the things that we use. Also bring a light, a headlamp or something for you to get around it and not trip or get lost. And also make sure that you have plenty of batteries, not only for your camera, but for your other devices like your headlamp. It would be a very bad thing for you to run out of batteries for your headlight. I'm sorry?
You skipped talking about your timer.
Timer. Oh,
Remote timer.
was that on my list? Oh, sorry, I skipped one. So yes, very important to have a remote, have a couple up here if you want to come up afterwards to take a look at them. So a remote is a must-have for long exposure photography because first of all, you want to make sure that your hand's off the camera. Secondly, you want to have the ability to leave your camera open for as long as you want. And even with a wired remote, you can get one wired remote for about 20 bucks. They have locking shutter buttons, so you can lock the shutter button down and leave your camera open for as long as you want. You cannot hold the button down with your thumb for very long, so you need a lock. Also, if you're wanting to do something like time-lapse photography, having a intervalometer is a good idea. I have this wireless remote which has an intervalometer built into it. Many of the Nikon cameras have intervalometers. That's just a fancy word for a timer. Some of the newer Canons have timers, but the older ones do not. So this device is great. It's about 100 bucks. I know from experience that it works through windshields. So when it's, I did a trip out to 11 Mile Reservoir back in December for the Geminids, and it was so cold I could only spend about 5 minutes outside my vehicle with my camera. So I set up the camera on the tripod, sat in my truck, and this worked right through my windshield. So that was a good thing. Worth the $100. So. All right, what's that? Next, other gear. Of course, you want a headlamp or flashlight. I talked about having the warm clothing and the layers. It's important to have an insulating layer like long johns and then an outer windproof layer. So the combination of those two things is going to help tremendously to keep you warm. Hat and gloves, also important. I always have a winter hat in my jacket, no matter what time of year it is. I've spent a lot of time up in the mountains. I know how cold it gets. Have good hiking shoes or boots. Bring with you plenty of water and snacks for the evening, and it's a good idea to have a first aid kit as well. All right, let's talk about camera settings, and I need to get a drink before I do that. Any questions so far? Yes, Marilyn?
When you're doing, say like a 20-minute exposure with the stars,
Mm-hmm.
or even for the Milky Way with the, the sectional verticals, is it any idea, would you use the mirror up? Or would you just let it do the mirror every time you know you got the remote or you got it wide open?
What Marilyn's asking is if it benefits you to use your mirror lockup function on your camera. And I would say that it really depends on your camera. I don't use it on mine, so I haven't seen any issues with the camera causing any motion blur in the images. We did have a student on actually our very first workshop. He had, I think, a Nikon D800 or something like that. And every time he took a picture, and we'd zoom in and look at the stars, they would look like little check marks. And so something was moving. So we tightened up everything on his tripod. We couldn't figure out what it was. And then I thought, well, what if you turned off or locked up your mirror? And that did the trick. So I would say it just depends on your camera. If you're getting movement in your pictures and everything else is tightened down and you can't figure out what's causing it, try the mirror lockup and see if that gets rid of the problem.
I think I'll do it both ways and see if it makes a difference.
Sure, yeah, that's always a good thing. So, Adam.
I need some comments now.
Oh, you have comments? Okay, so if you're viewing this on the live stream, you can post questions or comments, and we'll take some time every so often to field those from Adam there. Okay, thanks, Adam. Okay, so you can photograph the stars a couple different ways. You can photograph them as points of light. So the intent there is to not have any movement in the stars. Or you can photograph them as star trails. And we've seen examples of both so far. So first we're going to talk about photographing as points of light. You're going to want to be in the manual mode, both the manual shooting mode and the manual focus mode. We're going to talk about focusing in a little bit. Generally, you're going to want to shoot with your aperture wide open, whether that's 1.2, 2.8, or 4, whatever the widest aperture is on your lens. Shutter speeds are generally going to be in the 20 to 30 second range. ISO in the 3200 to 6400 range, depending upon your aperture and your shutter speed. You want to have your high ISO noise reduction function turned off. I'm told that that function only works on JPEGs, and you should be shooting in camera raw when you're doing these types of images, so turn that off. The long exposure noise reduction is the one that, if you've ever tried it, say you take a 30-second exposure, your camera is going to be working for another 30 seconds to produce another image and then subtract the noise. It compares the noise between the two and subtracts it. That function we'd say is optional, and the reason for that is, let's say you're photographing or taking a series of photographs to then stitch together to make long star trails. This function would not benefit you. It actually would hurt you, because if you think about it, taking a series of 30-second exposures, you're taking a 30-second picture, your camera is then not available for another 30 seconds, then you take another picture, so you're going to have gaps in your star trails. Okay? If you're only photographing images to use singly, just one image at a time, then of course you can turn on your long exposure noise reduction. I do know that the long exposure noise reduction can remove things from your images that you don't want removed. Actually, our friend Mark from Tamron showed me a picture that he took during the Geminids, and this function actually removed a faint meteor from his picture. So I've also been told that sometimes this function will reduce the noise to a point that when you bring it into your software program, the program may not recognize the noise as noise, so you have a more difficult time of reducing it if you're trying to use one of those tools in your program. White balance, I encourage people to experiment with white balance. I have a slide towards the end that shows an experiment that I did. I prefer a bluer tone to my skies, so I usually set my white balance to 3200, but I may change that during the night. If you are shooting in camera raw and you edit in a program like Lightroom or Camera Raw from Photoshop, you can easily adjust your white balance in post-processing. So this isn't a huge deal if you forget to change your white balance. Also want to mention to turn your image stabilization or vibration reduction off. Some lenses, like I have lenses that they are smart enough to know they're on a tripod, so the IS automatically turns off. Other lenses, you need to flip that switch on the side to turn them off, and I have a slide to show you what that looks like if you are on a tripod and it is on. So anybody familiar with the 500 rule? Okay, a couple people. There's a 400 rule, a 500 rule, and a 600 rule. So you can choose the one that fits most for you or that you like best. Some people think that the 500 rule is something that they absolutely have to live by. And I say that this is a guideline. This is a place to find your starting point. So the rule says if you take 500 and divide it by the focal length of your lens, then you will get a time for which you will not get any, or the maximum time for which you will not get any movement in your stars. So for example, I have a 14 millimeter lens. I shoot on a full frame camera. According to the rule, if I shoot a 36 second long exposure, then I should, that would be the maximum time for me so that I would not have any movement in my stars. I can tell you that if I shot a 36 second exposure with my 14 millimeter lens, I will have movement in my stars. So for me, it's more around 30. But if you use this as a guideline, find your starting point, look at your image and see what the movement looks like in your stars, then you can adjust accordingly, okay? I always encourage people to experiment and to not take these rules at face value, okay? Any questions on this? Okay. All right, so there's a good story behind this photo. Don and I were out at Pueblo Reservoir checking that location for its dark skies. And it was, I think, the first time I used my new Tamron 15-30 lens for night photography. And there is a switch on the side to turn on and off the vibration reduction. What I didn't realize was that I accidentally turned the vibration reduction on, and I took a whole bunch of pictures. I think I took 3 sets of pictures to stitch together for panoramas, and I looked at them and they were all fuzzy. And Don and I were trying to figure out what was happening, and of course we're out there in the dark, it's a brand new lens, and I'm like, oh great, you know, something's wrong. And then I even tried a different lens to see if, you know, it was my camera or if the lens. And then I noticed that the switch was flipped, and I had done that by accident. So one of the pieces of feedback we got on an early workshop, I used to send out a questionnaire to all my students. The one person said they weren't happy with their pictures because we forgot to tell them to look at them. So, yes, look at your picture after. So here is my advice that I'm going to tell you right now. Free, you don't have to come on the workshop. When you take a picture, especially of the night sky, look at it before you take another picture, okay? And zoom in and see what your stars look like. So, obviously, there's a problem with this image, okay? And the movement that you see in the stars is all because the vibration reduction function was turned on with my lens, okay? Once I figured that out, it was too cold for me to continue taking other pictures, but that was okay. So anyway, there's a little lesson learned for you. Here's one example from a location that we use out in Westcliff. This is our favorite little tree. This was taken earlier in the season, so the Milky Way is lower over the horizon. So here's their galactic core. This was shot at f4, 30 seconds, and ISO 6400. And there are some photographers who will tell you that you can't use an f4 lens, that you will get movement in your stars. And I say that's a relative statement. So there may be some movement in your stars, but when you zoom in really close and look at that, you need to be the judge whether or not that's acceptable to you. So if you're viewing something, and also judge it based on how the picture is going to be viewed. If the picture is going to be viewed online, it's not that big of a deal. If you're going to blow it up to a big print, then it may be a concern for you. But you don't have to go out and buy more expensive lenses just because somebody says you need a 2.8 lens. Okay. Here's another location out in Westcliff, f2.8, 20 seconds, 3200. And whenever I show this picture, somebody always asks me what that is. And that's obviously an alien spacecraft. So we weren't really sure what that was. It showed up in, I think, everybody's pictures. And it could be a satellite. Usually when you see an airplane, you see dashes or the strobes, you know, the result of the strobes. A lot of airplane trails are red. So that one's a little bit of a mystery to us, so that's why I say it's obviously an alien spacecraft. A couple others, picture on the right is out at the paint mines. Really great place. It's like you're on another planet when you're at the paint mines after dark. And here's our favorite little tree again. Nice shot of the galactic core, f4, 30 seconds, ISO 6400. This one at the paint mines, 2.8, 20 seconds, and ISO 3200. So you can see that with a lot of my pictures, I'm changing my settings. Again, I encourage you to experiment, right? You have all night, correct? You're going to be out there all night. Take the time to experiment. Don't just, you know, listen to somebody say, oh, well, these are the settings that you're supposed to have for your lens, and because of the 500 rule. Take shots at different settings. When you get back home, take a look at them, make sure that you're liking what you see. If you do, then you can make a note of what works for you, for your camera and lens combination. If you don't, then you need to make some adjustments the next time you go out. Did you have a question?
What month on the tree?
Oh, I'm not sure I know that one. I'm guessing this is May or June,
Yeah, I think so.
because I know from this, I just know because of the picture that we're looking off to the east. So the core of the Milky Way is generally in the southeast earlier in the season. Okay, or I shouldn't say generally, it is in the southeast early in the season. Okay. Adam, any questions from our online viewers?
Yeah, we have one.
Have one.
Angela Branson, and she asks, do you need to adjust your white balance if you're shooting raw? What do you do that?
Yeah, the question is, do we need to adjust white balance if shooting camera raw? We talked about that a little bit earlier, that I like to dial in an a white balance of 3200K because I usually like a more blue look to my skies like this. But if you forget to do it, you can easily do it in your post-processing. So as long as you're shooting in camera raw, when you make that selection in the software to change to, say, cloudy or shady or whatever, you're doing exactly the same thing that your camera is doing to the file. So it's not that big of a deal if you miss it. So is another question, Adam?
Jason just wants you to repeat the audience questions because he can't hear them on the screen.
Okay, did I not repeat the last one? Okay. Kate asked what time of year the picture on the left was taken, and I said I think it's May or June. Okay. Yes, question.
Are these two images a single image or multiple ones stitched?
These are, the question is, are these single images or multiple images stitched together? These are both single images. Okay.
Mike,
Yes.
did you use light painting on the image on the right?
Question is whether or not we use light painting. Actually, we use light painting on both pictures. So you can see there's a light source, which I think is our little LED panel here, lighting up the tree. And then we're going to talk more about lights and light painting a little bit later. but we have a technique for lighting up the hoodoos at the paint mines that is a lot of fun. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, but yes, both pictures have lights in there to illuminate the objects in the foreground. A couple more. This is a new place that we have available for us to photograph out in West Cliff. I didn't realize how much people liked windmills until I shared this one, and it had like 300 likes and like 100 shares, and I've never had that happen to a picture before. So you can see the Milky Way in the background, and shot at f4, 25 seconds, ISO 6400. This was on an adventure that Don and I took to Lake Kinney, way out east of here. And I think this is a satellite. It may also be the International Space Station. I remember seeing something going by in the sky as I was taking this picture. f4, 20 seconds, ISO 6400. Okay, another concern when you're out photographing is light pollution. So of course you generally want to be as far away from any light pollution as possible. Sometimes light pollution adds a nice touch to your images. This was taken out at Pueblo Reservoir, all the way at the end of the South Wildlife Road where the river comes in. And I have a night sky filter here that was given to me by the good people at Breakthrough Photography. And you can see the difference between these two images, that without the filter, there's a lot more yellow in the picture. With the filter, it gets rid of all that yellow and creates a different look to your image. Shot at the same settings, just the only difference is one is with the filter and one is without. Okay, any questions on shooting, any other questions on shooting as points of light? Adam? Somebody wants to know what kind of camera you use. I have a Canon, actually I have two Canon 6Ds, so that is a full frame camera. They now have the Canon 6D Mark II available. Okay, anything else? Okay, yes, Ben?
You mentioned not to use the long exposure noise reduction, but what about using your own like dark frames and then trying to use those to subtract the noise?
The question is whether or not it would be to your benefit to use the procedure where you shoot what's called a dark frame, which would be having a picture taken with the lens cap on and then reducing the noise in your image, utilizing that picture in your software. So if your software has that kind of capability, then of course you can certainly try that. I do know that you can do that in the program StarStax, that it allows you to load in what we call a dark frame, and it looks for the noise in the picture and then tries to reduce that from what we call the light, the exposed image. The thing about using that technique is that you have to make sure that the settings for your dark image are exactly the same as the settings for the light images. Okay, so any other questions? All right, so let's talk about photographing the stars as star trails. So you're going to be in either the manual mode or bulb mode, depending upon whether or not your exposures are longer than 30 seconds. So if you shoot in manual, the longest shutter speed that you can get is 30 seconds. If you shoot in bulb, then the camera allows you to leave the shutter open as long as the shutter button is depressed. That's why we need a locking shutter button on our remotes. You're going to be in the manual focus mode. Again, we'll talk about focus in a little bit. Your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are all going to vary depending upon your lighting conditions and how long of an exposure you're going to make. And I have a slide coming up that's going to show you my thought process for going from a shorter exposure to a very long exposure and creating the same exposure in your image. Again, high ISO noise reduction is off. Long exposure noise reduction, again, is optional. Depends on what you're photographing. If you are doing a series of shorter images, like say a series of images less than 4 minutes, and maybe you're going to stitch them together to make your star trails. Of course, you don't want any gaps. If I took a 4-minute exposure with my long exposure noise reduction on, I'm going to have to wait another 4 minutes before I can use my camera again, okay? If you're taking a really long exposure, then you will see the most benefit from this function. However, if you take a really long exposure, let's say I take a 30-minute exposure and I have this function turned on, I have to wait another 30 minutes for my camera to be active again. So what we recommend is if you want to try a really long shot and use this function, make that your last image of the evening, or make it the last image before you move to your next location. So what you can do, let's say I'm taking a 15-minute exposure. My exposure is done, but the camera's still working on taking the blank and reducing the noise. I can put my lens cap on, I can put my camera in my bag, I can put it in my car, and I can drive away. Everything will be fine unless I turn the camera off. So leave the camera on so it can do its thing. You can put it away, and then by the time you get to your next location or by the time you get home, then it'll be done. Okay? This is where using a timer or an intervalometer comes in handy. So if you want to set up a long series of shots, let's say I want to take 50 shots each at 2 minutes, I can set that up on my intervalometer and just hit the button and let it go. This is one of the tricks that you can use if you want to get a nap during the middle of the night. Okay. Again, turn off your image stabilization, especially for the really long exposures, because you don't want your camera sitting on your tripod with the shutter open for 5-10 minutes and your lens trying to stabilize the image. You'll get a much worse picture than the one I showed you earlier. So some examples of star trails. This is an almost 14-minute exposure. You notice that I'm not shooting at a high ISO because I have such a long exposure. It's really cool if you can get water in your foreground. That way the stars reflect in the water. And this fuzzy thing over there, that's the Milky Way. That's actually the core of the Milky Way. Here's one that I took on a very cold night. 76 images stitched together, each 25 seconds long at f2.8 and ISO 3200. One of the things that I do if I'm going to make an image like this, I will set my camera up with the appropriate settings, and then I'll take my remote, I'll just lock my shutter in place, and then once the camera takes one 25-second image, it just goes on to the next one, and it just keeps shooting until I unlock this. So that's one of my tricks for taking a nap. I can just set this up and let it go. And I'm not going to use that long exposure noise reduction because I don't want any gaps in my stars. And then you can see here, these red streaks are airplanes going by. And that's our favorite little tree again.
So those are stitched from top to bottom to get to the height you have there, right?
No.
Restate the question.
The question was whether or not the images were stacked from top to bottom. No. This is 76 images of the same scene. The only thing that's different is that the stars have moved. Their position has moved relative to the image before.
Okay, well you said stitched together, that's right.
Yeah, so the term is stacked. Yeah, so stitching we usually say for panoramas, stacking is the proper term. So there's a process that you can do with programs like StarStax or easily in Photoshop, where you just change the blending mode of the images to allow the lighter portions of the subsequent images to show through, and that's how you end up with your...
76 photographs.
There's 76 photographs that were put each as a separate layer into Photoshop and then blended together.
That's stitching it through me.
Okay, yeah, and my computer wheezed and coughed when I loaded 76 images into Photoshop, so it didn't like it too much. And I had to save this as a PSB file. If you're familiar with Photoshop, if you save as a Photoshop file, the extension is .psd. Anything over, 2 gigabytes or something is has to be saved as a PSB, which means Photoshop big. You know, that's the term, Photoshop big. So this was a 4 gigabyte file after I put everything together. Marilyn?
On that one that you showed where the trails are going over water with the reflection,
Yes?
could that possibly have been an 11-mile reservoir? I mean, not reservoir, 11-mile lake, I guess, way back in 11 miles?
The question is whether or not this was at 11 Mile Reservoir, and it's not, but you can get photos like this with any body of water. This was just a small pond next to where I was camping.
Okay.
So I just stayed up, and I think this was actually one of the very first pictures I took of the night sky with my DSLR. This was out in Crested Butte. Okay, so let's talk about exposure and judging your exposure. If you use your histogram on the back of your camera, which you should for judging your exposure, it should look something like this. And if you think about it, this makes sense. If you're familiar with how a histogram works, darker information is on the left side, lighter information is on the right. So in a typical night sky image, you will see 2 peaks near the left-hand side of your histogram, and then information trailing off as you go to the right. So there's a lot of dark information here in this image, so this histogram makes sense if you judge it based on this image. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, here's the slide I was talking about earlier about equivalent exposures. So these 2 images look the same or very close to it, right? You would say that my exposure here was the same as it is here. The difference between these 2 pictures is that this one was shot for the stars as points of light. This one was shot to create star trails. This is a 30-second exposure. This is a 16-minute exposure, okay? How did I figure out how to go from here to here and get the same exposure, okay? It really sucks if you have to wait 16 minutes to figure out you made a mistake. 32 minutes if you've used your long exposure noise reduction. That's why the night goes by so fast, right? Because if you're taking pictures this long. So here's my little trick, and I've gotten better at doing this. And I also encourage you to count on your fingers. It's easier to use your fingers to count when you're in the middle of darkness than it is to try to write something down on your phone or a piece of paper. So if you know how your settings change your exposure, you can think about this or think through this in your head and count how many stops of light you need to go from one exposure to the other. All right? So if you double your shutter speed, that increases your exposure by 1 stop. Okay? Everybody following me so far? So it's easiest if you start off with a 15 or 30-second exposure. In this example, I started off at 30 seconds. So 30 to 60 is 1 stop. 60 to 2 is another stop. 2 to 4 is a 3rd stop. 4 to 8 is 4 stops, 8 to 16 is 5 total stops. I've changed my exposure going from 30 seconds to 16 minutes by 5 total stops, okay? So now I have to compensate for that by changing my ISO and my aperture, all right? So then what I did was my original 30-second exposure was at 6400 ISO. Going from when you half your ISO, you've changed your exposure by 1 stop. So going 64 to 32 is 1, 32 to 16 is 2, 16 to 8 is 3, 8 to 4 is 4. So I've made up 4 stops by changing my ISO. Now I need to go 1 more. So every time you adjust your aperture by 3 positions, that's 1 stop of light. So I went from 4 to 5.6, that gives me 1 more stop of light. 1 plus 4 is 5, okay? So that's how I was able to figure out my equivalent exposure, okay? I see some confused faces. But this is not new math. This is the easier math, okay? So, and as you can see, okay, this is what I'm doing. 30 to 60 is 1, 60 to 2 is 2. This is literally what I'm doing in the dark, okay? So I've gotten really good at doing that. It just takes a little bit of practice in knowing what your exposures or what your settings do to your exposure, or you can use a cheat sheet, okay? This is courtesy of our good friend Mike Berenson, and what Mike did was he just did all the math while he was nice and warm at home and made this chart. And so the way you use this chart is that you first start with a very high ISO short exposure image. This image is not going to be useful for anything other than checking to see if you have a good exposure, okay? So you start here. If this gives you a good exposure and you want to then change from 4 seconds to say 8 minutes, you just follow this column down and choose these settings. And this exposure is equivalent to this exposure. If you start here and it's too dark, you can go 1 stop brighter or 2 stops brighter. If you find a good exposure, say here, then you stick to this column. If this is too bright, you can go 1 stop darker, 2 stops darker, okay? So you can have this loaded on your phone so that you can view it, although we kind of discourage turning things on in the dark. So our rule when we go on our workshops is that if you have to turn on a light, you have to ask first to make sure that nobody is exposing. And if everybody gives you the okay, then you're good to turn on a light, okay? So I have chosen to do things this way. It might be easier for you to have a little cheat sheet with you.
Why?
Question.
Use a red headlamp without causing issues?
The question is whether or not we can use a red headlamp without causing issues. Hold on to that thought. I have a slide to answer that question, okay? You may be surprised with the answer. All right, so let's talk about focusing. One of the hardest things to do is focus your camera in the dark. If you've tried it with your autofocus on, you know that it just doesn't work. So our trick, the thing that we like to do, is set our focus before it gets dark, okay? So you can use your autofocus to focus on something far off in the distance. Then your lens will be set to the infinity position, which is normally where we would shoot when we're photographing the night sky. You can make a mental note of where the focus ring sits at infinity and just make sure that you dial that back in when you're ready to photograph after dark. Or we bring with us a roll of painter's tape and we'll put a piece of tape on your lens to make sure that your focus ring doesn't move while you're out photographing. You have to make sure that you flip your switch, your autofocus switch, to manual, because you don't want your lens trying to focus in the dark with a piece of tape on it. That's a good way to ruin your lens. Okay? Another thing we do if we need to reset someone's focus after it's gotten dark, we can shine a light or laser pointer on something in the distance. I have this super high power laser pointer that takes down airplanes, and this is bright enough that if I wave it on something in the distance that your autofocus will pick up on it. This is also a device I use to give a tour of the night sky. When you point it up to the stars, it looks like it's actually touching the stars. It's really cool. Another method that a lot of people prefer to use is their live view. So if you flip on your live view and you zoom in on the brightest lights in the sky, then you can move your focus ring, set your focus manually. You would set it to where those points of light are at their smallest, okay? Also, we'll say that using your live view drains your batteries quicker. I have never gotten into the habit of using my live view. I always just use my viewfinder. So that's really a personal preference. All right, and then another challenge we have is lining up our shot. Of course, if it's dark and whatever is in front of you is dark, when you look through your viewfinder or your live view, you can't see anything. So one of the tricks that we recommend is to just crank up your ISO really high, as high as it can go, and then take a short exposure, maybe 4 or 5 seconds, and that's your test shot. You don't then have to wait 30 seconds to see what you got. That picture's probably going to be useless because it's at such a high ISO, but it's going to allow you to see what's in your frame, and then you can adjust accordingly. I have a horizontal level on my LCD screen, so I use that all the time. It at least eliminates one problem, so I know that my horizon is level. Another thing that we'll do is light something up that's in your frame, and then you can adjust your camera to make sure that you have your shot lined up properly. Okay, so who asked the question about red headlamps? Okay, so here's my headlamp. This has 2 levels of white and 1 level of red. Yes, it is true that red will help preserve your night vision. However, it's very easy to not realize that your headlamp is on if it's red. And then you end up with a picture like this. And then if you're shooting with a group of people, you've just ruined everybody's pictures, and your camera may accidentally fall off its tripod sometime in the night. So we recommend that you use a white light for if you need to see something instead of your red lamp, because it's easy to forget that it's on because you can't see it very well. And if you have an image like this that's saturated with red light, you cannot fix it unless you just make a black and white image. So there's nothing you can do to get rid of that red. Okay, Ben.
Have you had like similar problems with like the lights on the front of the cameras, like for the rangefinders or whatever, like lighting up?
The question is whether or not we've had issues with lights that are in front of cameras. Yes, we have. My camera, if I use my timer, has a red light that blinks before the shutter goes off. That will light up a scene. Some cameras have the autofocus lights that come on, but if you're shooting in manual focus, that shouldn't be an issue. So occasionally we have somebody who has a camera that a light will come on, and we'll try to figure out how to turn that off or get rid of that. That can be a problem. One night we were photographing at the barn, and everybody was getting this red glow in their images, and nobody had a light on. And we couldn't figure out where this light was coming from. It turned out that some people had gone back to their car to warm up, and the driver had his foot on the brake pedal. And the whole scene was lit up red. I had to go and tell him to take his foot off the brake pedal. So those kinds of things can really saturate your images, and you just have to figure out a solution to get rid of them. Okay. Any other questions? Adam, anything from online? No? Okay. All right. So let's talk about light painting. So there's a variety of things that we can use to illuminate objects in our pictures. And I have some things here that we use. We have an LED panel. Actually, we have two of these. These are some diffusers that we put on the top to block some of the light. These are actually for video, but they work pretty well for what we call low-level lighting, LLL, low-level lighting. So normally we turn these on at the lowest setting, and many times the lowest setting is too bright for what we're photographing. We're in a really dark area. So that's why we have the diffusers to block some of the light. And we have found that we like these much better than trying to use a flashlight. You can use a light like this, and the technique would be, let's pretend the screen is a barn. Let's say I want to illuminate the barn. I'm using the lamp like a paintbrush to cast light on it so that it shows up in my images. Using a steady source of light creates a more even amount of light on your subject, and you don't have to try to, fill it in properly. This is going to fill in. A handheld flashlight, you're going to end up with some gaps or some areas that are lit more than others. So we really like the LED panels. Another little thing that we have that works tremendously, and we use these out at the paint mines, these little LED votive candles throw out an amazing amount of light, especially when you're out in pitch dark. And we have set 4 of these out in that area in the paint mines where the big hoodoos are, and they have lit up the hoodoos very well. So we like these a lot. You can buy like a 12-pack of these for $6 or something at Target or Walmart, and the batteries last a long time. We also use these as lighted breadcrumbs. There's one place in Westcliff where we have an optional hike to get to this one high point, and we've just thrown these on the ground to make sure that we get back to the right place, because we have gotten turned around out there, and it's easy to do. So those are really cool. There's all kinds of things that you can use. We have had a lot of fun with the lightsabers, and I have at least one picture in here that shows us doing some stuff with the lightsabers. If you get cold on one of the workshops, we will hand you a lightsaber, and it's amazing how quickly you warm up when you're having a duel with someone. So that's one of our tricks for staying warm. These little mini mag lights are kind of cool. If you take off the lens, it exposes the bulb, and so you can do some drawing and stuff like that. Also, anything that you find, any little toys or anything that light up, you can use. This one's pretty cool. Little mini lightsaber, I think it was $2 at Cabela's. I have a picture of Don swinging this around, making like a illuminated globe. So fun stuff. Anything that you find can be used for light painting. All right, let's see. I have made some snoots for some of my lights. I have a couple over in one of my bags there. They have gotten a little bit overused during our trip, so they're not very pretty at this point. But I've made some snoots for these lights so that we can direct the light onto a subject instead of it just spreading out. It's amazing how far the light spreads when you're out in complete darkness. Also, the diffusers that I used, I bought some extra ones so that we can dim these down some more. And then don't always go out when there's no moon. The moon creates great lighting effects on the things that you're photographing, and I have some examples to show you about that. Here's a couple little creative things that I've done. This was on a camping trip out one fall. I took an LED panel, put it on my little tripod here, set it on the ground. These can be attached to a tripod. And illuminated these trees and positioned my shot to make it look like the Milky Way was coming right out of the trees. This is our barn out in Westcliff. Sometimes we put some lights inside to give you a nice kind of warm, inviting feeling of the picture. This is out at the paint mines. This picture on the right, we kind of discovered this late last season, this spot, and we really like it. It's really fun, especially later in the season. You can see the Milky Way in the sky. This particular day, we saw the Milky Way up until almost the point the sun came up. It was an amazingly clear night. We had a lot of fun. So all of these hoodoos are this white color. So there are actually two sources of light here. We have the LED panel illuminating this little guy, and then we have a couple of LED votive candles behind it illuminating the hoodoos in the background. And then this picture was a happy accident. Don was adjusting one of our lights, or he dropped something, or I don't remember what happened, but he turned on his flashlight and illuminated a rock that was in front of him, and the light from that rock bounced back and illuminated this hoodoo. And I happened to see it, and I said, wait, do that again. And then I got this picture, and then we set up a LED panel to actually face the rock, and then the light bounced off the rock and back to the hoodoos that we were photographing. So, happy accident. Here's another one at the paint mines. In this spot, one of the things we do is put an LED panel behind this hoodoo, facing these hoodoos, and got some really great clouds in the sky as well. I also want to point out that photographing the clouds at night can be really fun. And this is also my reminder to tell you to not allow an app to decide whether or not you're going to go out and shoot, okay? Don can tell you that most of the times that we've gone to Westcliff and we've checked the weather apps have been wrong. Most of the time, okay? I once had somebody tell me, I'm not sure I'm going to go out tonight because my app says it's not going to be ideal conditions. I showed him this picture. I said, here's a picture I took under non-ideal conditions. And he said, okay, I'm going out. All right. So clouds can be a lot of fun, especially if you're doing really long exposures, because just like photographing water going through a creek, you can get the nice movement in the clouds. So this is a 6.2 minute exposure, f2.8 ISO 400. Here's a new location we have access to out east near the paint mines. We may try to incorporate this into our paint mines workshops. This was a pretty amazing night with these clouds going by, and you can see 30-second exposure, ISO 800. This is kind of cool. This is the sunset here, and this is light pollution from Denver over there. So. Again, don't be afraid to go out when the moon is out. You can still see the Milky Way depending upon where the moon is relative to the Milky Way. It's just not as bright as it would be on a night when there's no moon. So this is a 30-second exposure, ISO 3200, and you can see that the trees are very nicely lit by the moon. Here's another new location for our Westcliff workshops. This was one of the first pictures I took with my Tamron 15 to 30. I'm really excited about having this for this season and spending a whole season shooting the night sky. I think I'm going to get some really great stuff. So this was one of those times where I counted on my fingers, how would I go from 30 seconds to 16 minutes? So f8, 16 minutes, ISO 100. And I will tell you, every picture that I took with this lens at these settings in this location, I didn't have to do any editing. Even if I tried to do any editing in my software, it didn't seem to do any good to the pictures. So I'm like, wow, this is pretty awesome. Here's mine out in Victor. It's illuminated by the moon. Also, if you turn facing the moon, you can get the sunburst effect like you do with the sun if you shoot at f16. Here's one shot, a couple looks at the same scene. This was on a full moon night. The moon had just come up, and this was in the fall. This is a great spot. You can see the Milky Way a little bit over here, and the moon has very nicely illuminated the foreground. All right, any questions on light painting? Adam, question from online.
Yeah, this person asks, do you recommend turning down the LCD brightness on your computer? Because he's worried that if you don't, your image will turn into that.
The LCD brightness on the computer or the camera? On the camera. Okay, so the question is whether or not I recommend turning down the LCD brightness on your camera, and the answer is yes. So first of all, if you turn on or you view a picture on your LCD screen and it's pitch black outside, it's going to kind of shock you for a bit because your eyes have adjusted for the dark. So it's a good idea to turn your LCD camera or your LCD screen down. The other thing is that with your LCD screen turned up, it may fool you into thinking that you have a proper exposure when you do not. So you should be using a combination of looking at your LCD screen and your histogram to judge whether or not you have a good exposure. Okay. Anything else, Adam? Okay. Any other questions from the crowd? All right. So let's talk about panoramas. Did I skip a slide? Hold on. Okay. So for panoramas, you are shooting a series of images to then stitch together. And if you are using a wide-angle lens, it is recommended that you shoot vertical images and then stitch them together to make a horizontal panorama. And the reason for that is because with wide-angle lenses, they normally have a lot of distortion, and most of your distortions are on the outer edges of your images. So if you allow enough space above and below your subject, and then you shoot a series of vertical pictures, then when you stitch them together, you end up cropping the top and the bottom of that stitch, and you end up with the sweet spot that's in the middle. Okay? It's not to say you can't do horizontal images and stitch those together. It's just a different method, and you can, of course, try both. Remember, you have all night, right? So I mentioned the L bracket, and having one of those is a big advantage, especially if you're shooting vertical shots. You want to overlap your frames about 30 to 50%, which is a little bit difficult to judge when you're out in the dark and you don't want to keep turning a light on and stuff. My tripod head has markings on it, so I can kind of try to guess. Normally what I'm doing is I'm looking at the camera and where the lens is pointing, and I'm just kind of eyeballing it and moving my camera a little bit each time to make sure that I have enough overlap. And then you're going to stitch files together using Photoshop or Lightroom or another dedicated software program for making panoramas. So to show you some examples, this is just a two horizontal frames stitched together, each 30 seconds, ISO 6400, our favorite little tree again. This is the picture that we started out with. This is 13 vertical frames, each at 25 seconds, ISO 3200 and f2.8. So this is shot early in the season. I believe this was shot in April. And this is when you can see the entire arc of the Milky Way over the eastern horizon. And at that time of the year, you can stitch images together like this to create these types of panos. The drawback is that you can't see this until 2:30 in the morning at that time of the year. Okay. Here's one that's 14 vertical images, each at 20 seconds, 6400 f2.8. Again, this was taken in late March, I believe, last year. Here's a 7-image stitch, 7 vertical images out at the paint mines. We used some of our LED votive candles to light up some hoodoos there. Okay, any questions about panoramas? Yes?
Have you ever had issues with, like, as you shoot them, like the stars move, or do you just have to be like as quick as possible and you usually works out okay?
The question is whether or not I've had issues with the stars moving as I'm trying to shoot a series of images to stack together. So first of all, you want to try to be as quick as possible. Sometimes what happens when you're stitching images together is that you'll get double images, so that you'll get like 2 stars next to each other that are supposed to be 1 star. So most of those errors tend to occur at the edges of your images. So hopefully they're in places where you are able to crop out. And then sometimes you get the movement again at those edges of your frames because of the distortions of the lenses. So if you are moving around, if you think about it, if you're moving around, you have taking vertical shots and you have some really big distortion up in the top of your sky, it's going to be harder to stitch together. So you have to make sure that you have enough to crop out so that you end up with that sweet spot. Okay? Any questions? Yes?
Do you frequently shoot panoramas when you go out on a photo shoot?
Define frequently. The question was whether I frequently shoot panoramas. So
Whenever you go on a photo shoot, can you just shoot what's in the field of your view, or do you frequently do panoramic photography to get your shots?
I most often do the panoramic stuff. If we're talking night sky, I try to do that in the earlier part of the season. That way I can try to get that whole arc of the Milky Way. Later on in the season, I don't do a whole lot of panos. It's also something that if I do a pano, it's usually something I have to do when I'm out on my own, because it takes quite a bit of time. And on our workshops, as Don will attest to, that when we have a workshop, our students are our priority. So we need to make sure that everybody is doing well before we take pictures for ourselves. So I don't even set up my camera until I know everybody is okay and they're shooting away. So with having to have the time and the patience to set up a pano and shoot it, it's a little bit difficult when I'm doing it on a workshop. So yeah, but I
Develop skill, you know.
yeah, it takes some practice, and it does help if you can easily level out your tripod, which can be really difficult in the dark. So it also requires you to be in a good spot, you know. So that place with the barn, that's a great location for the panos. This new location with that old barn, or that old farmhouse, that's going to be another one that we're going to want to try early in the season. So, okay, all right. Any other questions? All right. Oops, sorry, I keep skipping slides. So we talked a little bit about stacking earlier. So stacking is the process of blending several images together, normally to get longer star trails. It also can be used as a technique to reduce noise. So there are some programs out there. You can create star trails in Photoshop very easily. There's also a free program called Star Stacks that you can try. If you try Star Stacks, you have to note that if you're shooting in camera raw, those raw files need to be transferred or saved as TIFF files or JPEG files before you can put them into Star Stacks. Star Stacks also does have that feature that Ben asked about, where you can take some blanks, pictures with the lens cap on, and load them into the sequence to help to reduce noise. There are some newer programs out there now specifically made for noise reduction, and with these programs you take a series of maybe 6 or 10 images and at higher ISOs, and then you stack them together in the software, and it somehow makes sure that all the stars line up, and it looks at the noise that's in the images and gets rid of them. So I have seen people take very high ISO shots that after stacking them together in one of these programs, they look like they were taken at a very low ISO. So Starry Landscape is one that's pretty popular for Mac users. Sequitur is for PC. I had a problem with my computer, so I couldn't load Sequitur, so now I think I have the problem fixed, and I'm looking forward to doing some experimenting with that. I also know somebody who recently loaded, I think, 80 frames into Starry Landscape and got a really amazing image. So you can load just a handful. It's recommended 6 or 10, or you can put a whole bunch in there. So here's an example of stacking. This image consists of 11 individual images, each at a 2-minute exposure, f2.8, ISO 3200. So if each image only has so much star trail in it, we've created much longer star trails by stacking them all together. In the process, in Photoshop, you take the images, if you're familiar with using layers, you take all of the individual images, load them into one file as separate layers, select all the files, or select all the layers except for the last one, change the blending mode to lighten. Lighten allows the lighter information from one layer below to show through. And as you do that with all of the layers, then you end up with all of your star trails. And this line across here we think is a satellite. Could also be an alien spacecraft. So. All right, let's talk about composites and blends. And there's a difference between the two. A blend would be if you photographed a scene and took 2 different exposures and then put them together in a software program. So for example, let's say you, and I actually did this once, I was at a location and photographed the scene while the moon was up, and then waited for the moon to go down so that my stars would be brighter, my sky would be darker, and I took more pictures after the moon went down, and then I blended those together so that I had exposure for the foreground and then exposure for my sky. A composite is when you've taken pictures from completely different locations and blended them together. So a blend would be same location, same shoot, just different exposures. A composite would be taking a picture from one shoot and another picture from another shoot and putting them together. Okay? And then, of course, you can do that with layers and layer masks in Photoshop. And here's an example. I got a lot of buzz for this one when I posted it last week. I didn't expect that. But this is an image I showed earlier. This was one, actually the one image I showed with my friend Andrew's quote on it. And using layers in Photoshop, I blended the two together. And I'm going to make a little video to show how I did this. I also had to go a little bit further and adjust the color on both images so it looked like they matched. That's one of the biggest challenges with creating composites, is making them look like they're real. And so essentially what I did was cut out the sky from this image and then drop this one behind the mountains, and that was the result. All right, another thing that I always encourage people to do with any type of photography is be creative. And we call this the creepy shot. This was, again, out in Westcliff. This is the big barn in the background. This is the little barn. And Mark Morris from Tamron usually joins me on one of the workshops. And this was Mark poking his head inside this room in the barn with his red headlamp on. And when we saw that and saw the light coming out between the boards, we said, stay there. So we had made him stay there for about 10 minutes while we took some pictures. So. Here's one with Don and I having a lightsaber duel at the paint mines. So just a little bit of fun that we have. And again, if you get cold, have a duel with somebody with a lightsaber and you will warm up very quickly. A couple of examples of lighting our barn. So this one, we used the flashlight to illuminate the side of the barn. And this other shot, this is my friend John, and I was trying to get a shot of the beam of light going up in the sky, and then I noticed as he moved the flashlight around a little bit, he was illuminating the roof and the crow's nest, or whatever you call that up here. So I asked him to hold that pose and got that shot. Using different lights can give you different results too. So we have this little pop-up tent that we use as a prop, and the tent is actually blue. And when we put an LED panel inside, I put the rain cover over the LED panel, and it shows the tent as its true color. If I put LED votive candles inside, it makes the tent yellow. So I can create different effects with different lights. Here's 3 different views of our barn, and here's another great example of why you shouldn't be disappointed if you see clouds. So really cool shot. Here's one where we illuminated the whole barn. Here's one where a car driving by the road illuminated the right side. And then here's the creepy shot with somebody. I think I just put my headlamp in there on the red mode and laid it down. Here's another shot of the barn. This was last year, July. This was, again, Mark from Tamron shining a light on the other side of the barn through the cracks in the boards. And this is actually a 3-image blend. So each of the 3 images showed different streaks of light coming through the boards. So when I blended them together in Photoshop using the lighten mode, then it allowed all those streaks to come through in a single image. Here's one of my favorite shots, an abandoned house out by Spinney. Don and I had a lot of fun this night. There's a spooky story involved with this, this house. But what we were doing, we were taking turns. This is the door right here. We had our cameras set up, and one of us would go into the door of the house, and when the other person by the cameras would say go, we'd shine the light this way for a few seconds, and then the person by the cameras would say switch, and then we turn around the other direction and light up this way. So we had a lot of fun that night, and I can tell you the spooky story later if you want to. So. Here's what I was talking about with changing your white balance. So this is 3200, usually where I shoot when I'm doing night sky stuff. This is that old farmhouse that we recently got to use. Sometimes if there's clouds in the sky, I encourage people to turn up their white balance to 6,000 or 7,000, or go into the shade mode, and you get this fiery look to the sky. And then just for the heck of it, I tried the fluorescence setting, and it gave me this pinkish look. So experiment with your white balance settings, and you may get something that you really like that you didn't expect. All right, I'm going to give you some tips on some apps to use for planning. A lot of people like the photographer's ephemeris. I like PhotoPills a lot. Again, I think that's about $10. It's well worth the investment. For viewing what's in the sky, apps like Planets and Skyview, there's a bunch of them out there, but those are pretty good. And then for weather, I think Don uses Dark Sky. There's another one that I recently picked up called Clear Sky, but whenever I turn it on, it tells me I'm somewhere in England, and I don't know how to set it to my location, so I have kind of given up on that one. But the Clear Sky will show you how much cloud cover you're supposed to have throughout the night, and sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. Some resources for you. I mentioned Royce Baer earlier. He has a great ebook called Milky Way Nightscapes. I highly recommend it. I learned a lot from reading that book. He also has some very active Facebook and Instagram groups called Nightscaper. So I encourage you to check those out. If you want to feel really, really inadequate about your night sky photography, go and check those out on Facebook and Instagram. Jennifer Wu, who's a friend of ours, she's a Canada Explorer of Light. She did a program for us a few years ago. She has a great book called Photographing the Night Sky. I think that's a typo. And then our friend Mike Berenson up in Denver, he does some workshops in places like Moab. There also is a night sky symposium that Royce is putting on in Moab at the beginning of May. I'm not sure if that's full. I'll find out on Monday when I talk to Royce, but Mike is one of his instructors. And I want to leave you with this message: have fun and be safe, and this exciting story about this picture. So my plan for this night was to lug all my gear out to this location. It was only a few minute walk from the trailhead parking lot, and set up, photograph the Milky Way, the night sky, wait for sunrise, and photograph the sunrise, because this is a really cool location. The river's running right through here. And it rained just before I got there, so everything was wet. And I also saw a bear on my way in. So about 2 o'clock in the morning, I got tired of standing, and I thought, oh, I really need to sit down or lay down. And I couldn't sit on the grass because it was all wet. So I decided to climb in the tent and lay down for a little bit. And it's so nice and peaceful, and I can hear the water going by. And suddenly I heard this unbelievable growling noise. And I thought, oh no. And I already had bear on my mind because I saw one, even though it was like 8 miles down the road. I tensed up like this, and I'm like waiting for the claw to come through the side of the tent. And then I heard the noise again, and it turned out to be my stomach. I had never heard my stomach make that noise, but when you're out in the middle of nowhere in the dark at 2 o'clock in the morning, you hear things differently. So just be careful when you're out there. So let's see, do we have any other questions? Anybody else? Question here?
How do you get access to those buildings?
You have to contact the owners. So we have,
Authorized access?
yes, so.
Notice the lack of graffiti, so
Yeah, the farmhouse that I showed you, I was able to contact the owner, and he allows us to go out there. All the locations that we use on our Westcliff workshops are on private property, which I think is a really nice feature to our workshops, because we don't have to compete with anybody else. We're there on our own. The owners know we're there, and we can do what we need to do without being disturbed, and it just creates a nice experience for everybody. So, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that question. He asked about getting access to private property. So you need to find out who the owners are. So you can look up county records, and then that will give you the owner's name and their mailing address, and then you can send them a letter and ask them for permission. So, but I highly recommend you don't go on private property without permission, even if there aren't any no trespassing signs. So if you don't know whose property it is, then you should stay off. Adam, question from online?
Yeah, this person wants to know if you have any recommended classes or videos that help you learn how to use Photoshop.
The question is whether or not I have recommendations for classes or videos on how to use Photoshop, and the answer is yes. My classes, which I'll be starting up again in April. If you're from out of town, then Kelby has some good stuff. If you join them, there's all kinds of stuff that's out there. But I first would read reviews before you sign up for anything, because it's awful hard to learn Photoshop from YouTube videos unless you already have a good solid knowledge of the program. So a lot of those instructors who make the videos, they assume that you know certain things, and they'll go fast or they'll skip over something, and then you're left saying, what did they just do? And you can't raise your hand and ask them a question. So anything, Adam, another question?
Yeah, this person wants to know if there's a way to get a printout of any of the slides, especially the ones that have specific information.
I have the slides available for people who do join us on a workshop. I have not made them available to the general public. But if you purchase one of the books, like I showed you with Jennifer Wu and with Royce Bear, all that information is there. It's fairly common knowledge. The question was whether or not there were, that I would make the slides available for people. So, anything else? No? Anybody else? Yes?
On your workshops, when the Milky Way rises later, say 2:30 in the morning, what do you do before the Milky Way?
We have pagan rituals, and no, I'm kidding. The question was, what do we do while we're waiting for the Milky Way to rise? We're still photographing, so yeah, we're out there doing what we can, and that's a good time to play around with lights and try different things. So we're making sure that everybody still stays active while we're waiting. And then with the paint mines, we will move to a specific location that will be good to see the Milky Way rising and get images from that vantage point. Okay? Anything else?
So are all your offerings on your website?
Yes, if you go to my website, threepeaksphoto.com, you can click the box that says workshops. That will take you to the page for our Westcliff workshops, and there's also a link there for the Paint Mines workshop. So all the dates and registering is there. Also, that reminds me, the question was whether or not all the workshop dates were on the website, and yes, they are. I am offering what I'm calling a Friends and Lovers discount until the end of February in honor of Valentine's Day. So if you sign up with a friend or a spouse or a partner as two people, you will each receive $50 off the cost of a workshop in Westcliff. Okay. Anything else? Adam?
This person wants to know the ghost story.
Oh, the ghost story. All right, do we have time for that? I can go back. Don remembered this well, so go back to that. Here we go. Okay, so did I say the question? The question was the person wanted to hear the ghost story. So this end of the house is separated from the main part of the house. There are two staircases. There's one inside this main door, and then there's one on this side of the building that goes up to what I'm assuming are two bedrooms over here. The staircase in the middle is not very, we were scared to go up that one, so we didn't go up that one because it looked kind of rickety. This one, I went up here and I went into this room, And I'm shining a light out through the window, and Don's directing me where I should shine the light to get the best effect. And suddenly I hear footsteps coming towards me from the other side of this wall, up here on the second level. There's a wall separating this side of the house from this side of the house. And I hear footsteps coming towards me, and they stopped when they got to the wall. And as they're coming towards me, I'm yelling out at Don. I'm like, hey, Don, I hear footsteps. And he's like, okay, that's good. Maybe it's an animal. I'm like, okay, yeah, maybe it's an animal. Or maybe it's the stairs creaking, because I just walked up those rickety stairs. And then it wasn't until we started driving home that I started to freak out. I'm like, because I have done plenty of ghost investigating, paranormal investigations, and I haven't had an experience quite like that. And I was, as we were driving home, I said to Don, that wasn't an animal. That was bipedal, and it wasn't my stomach. No, I've never heard my stomach sound like footsteps. So that would be very unusual. Again, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. If you have any other questions, please let me know. Again, you can come up here and take a look at some of the equipment we have. And I'm not sure what time Mary Jo is going to kick us all out, but you don't want to, make Mary Jo get to that point, right?
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.